I would like to introduce Ellen Efros, who will be introducing our speaker and program for today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Before I introduce Andrew, anybody who's attending Galina's presentation next week should really read the 2 short stories that she sent around. I think that would be very helpful in understanding some of the points she's going to make. I read them last night. They don't take very long to read. So if you can make the time, I encourage you to read them. Andrew Wolpert, who is presenting today, is an associate professor in the Department of Classics. And he's also a director of UF Quest. And for those of you who don't know what it is and are interested, you can probably Google it. I don't want to take up his time, spending too much time talking about that program, because what he's really here to talk about today is the fact that he is a Greek historian who has written primarily on classical Athens, with particular attention to questions concerning democratic discourse and ideology. He also writes on Athenian political culture, law, and society. His book, Remembering Defeat, Civil War, and Civil Memory in Ancient Athens, which was published in 2002, examines the social and cultural impact of the Civil War of 404 and 403 on Athens. And he draws widely from recent research on social memory. Andrew also considers how the Athenians confronted the troubling memories of defeat in civil war. And he suggests that Athenians constructed conflicting and contradictory images of the past that threatened to disrupt the reconciliation. Andrew also sees some similarities between what the Athenians were facing then and what we are facing now in terms of our culture and our society. And I think that's a very interesting topic to be explored, if not during his presentation, certainly during the Q&A, which will follow his presentation. And with that, I turn the course over to Andrew. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ellen, for the introduction, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about the 30 of Athens and the Civil War of 404 to 403. This is a topic, as Ellen mentioned, I think is quite timely in light of conflicts that we're dealing with how we understand our democracy, how we understand conflict within the democracy, and how we're representing our immediate past. I've been interested in the Civil War of Athens. It's a very short period of time. We're talking about a little over a year, the Civil War, that is. Since I started studying ancient Greek history, I remember as a first-year student in college in 1983, I was reading Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. It's a very powerful history of a war. If you haven't had the chance to read it, I strongly recommend that you do so. There's a lot in it that's very rich about how we understand civil society, conflict, how we deal with the past. And there's one really powerful event that struck me, which was the Civil War of Corcyra. And Thucydides depicts it in a way that's really unique. And one of the things he talks about is how words lost their meaning in the Civil War because they just use words to justify the most atrocious, violent, despicable forms of behavior. And then the other thing he mentions is how I think he highlights this civil war in particular, because he says that this was the beginning of additional civil wars like that throughout the ancient Greek world, and that there will be a cycle of these kinds of civil wars taking place in other regions of ancient Greece. So I finished reading that history work, and I kept going through the history of ancient Greece, and I get to the Civil War of Athens, and you're expecting it to be like the Civil War of Corcyra, and it's not. It's very different. And so I couldn't understand why Thucydides sets us up for a civil war to be in a certain model. And then when you get to Athens, it doesn't fit that model. Unfortunately, Thucydides never finished his history. So I don't know what he would have said about the Civil War of Athens. But I suspect he did intend for us to think about the Athenian Civil War when we read Corcyra. And that's at least been a long strand in my thought about the Athenian Civil War. All right, so let me share my PowerPoint presentation while I go through today's talk. So let's start off with the surrender to Sparta in 404 BCE. So the Peloponnesian War between Athens and its allies and Sparta and her allies took place for about 27 years. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind when we think about the civil war that takes place after the Peloponnesian War. This was a 27-year-long war. That's longer than the longest war that America has faced, the Afghan War, right, which is now coming to a close. Which is extraordinary because ancient warfare was not like that. For the most part, in the Greek world, ancient wars were one season, one summer, one or two battles. That was it. You don't have these extended conflicts. So the Peloponnesian War was unprecedented in ancient Greek history. They had nothing comparable to it. Now, when you think about what we're dealing with today with the aftermath of the Afghanistan war, we've had a lot of very sustained conflicts in the last 100 years, the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and each of these conflicts differed greatly. There is really nothing comparable for the Athenians before the Peloponnesian War. Now, some of you may be familiar with the Persian Wars, but even that was fundamentally different because the Persian Wars consisted of only 2 invasions and only 4 battles. So it was very different experience for the Athenians than anything after that. And the Peloponnesian War, routinely through it, the Athenians had to deal with the Spartans invading Attica, the rural area of Athens, and besieging the city. So in many years of the Peloponnesian War, people who lived in the countryside had to flee from their homes and live in Athens, in makeshift shelters, tents, and whatnot. And so this was a kind of, emergency situation that they were dealing with for decades. The plague of Athens came in the early years of the war, which devastated a lot of the population. And it was aggravated by the fact that so many people had to be living together, clustered within Athens in the city proper because of the Spartan invasion. So they had been in this really serious emergency conflict for decades. So then finally the war comes in 404, and Athens is forced to surrender to Sparta. So I think this adds a lot to the aftermath that we'll be talking about today. I'm also sharing on this slide a quote that's from Xenophon's history. He picks up at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And this history would have been, people would have read it in the 4th century of classical Greece, BCE, in the 300s. This would have been after Sparta had actually been defeated. And this would have been at a time when Thebes was in power. And so I think for an audience that would read this sentiment, it is filled with a lot of irony the joy and jubilation that people were celebrating the defeat of Athens. Lysander sailed into the Piraeus. The Piraeus is the Athenian port. And the exiles returned and they began to raise the walls to the music of pipe girls with great enthusiasm, thinking that day to be the beginning of freedom for Greece. Well, it's actually going to be the beginning of slaughter for the Athenians. And it was going to be the beginning of Sparta trying to gain hegemony over the rest of the Greek city-states. So far from being the beginning of freedom, this was yet part of this cycle of conflict that we see repeated over and over. So this start to the of Xenophon's history is really highlighting more of the tragedy of the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath, that it's just going to continue to cause problems for the Greeks. So an important part of understanding the Civil War that comes up next is that the Athenian democracy is actually allowed to remain. Sparta does not require Athens to change its form of government. The Athenians later will imagine or remember this event differently, but the terms of the surrender are pretty severe for the Athenians. The terms are essentially make sure that Sparta stays in power and that Athens can't threaten Sparta. So the first thing is the destruction of part of the long walls of Athens. The long walls, and this is actually a segment of them that you can see in modern day Athens, connected the city to its port, to the Piraeus. And the purpose of these long walls was so that if, and in fact when, Sparta would besiege the city, the Athenians could still supply the people with food because they could bring in by ship food from other city-states and then cart it by the long walls to the city. By destroying segments of the long walls, Athens could no longer do that. So the destruction of these walls were intended to make sure that Athens couldn't hold out against the siege by Sparta. So this made sure Athens remained vulnerable to invasion. Dissolution of the Athenian Empire meant that Athens wouldn't have any money. And without money, it couldn't gain a larger military, ships, and become a military threat to Sparta. Same reason for the surrender of most of the Athenian warships. This would prevent Athens from being able to conquer other city-states, and it would prevent Athens from being able to threaten Sparta. And last but not least, probably the worst part about the surrender for the Athenians is they had to become a member of the Peloponnesian League. Sparta was in charge of the Peloponnesian League. This meant Athens had to have the same friends and same enemies as Sparta. It meant that if Sparta declared war, Athens would have to fight with Sparta. So in some ways, this is kind of like the Soviet Union for ancient Greece. So all of these terms are to make sure that Athens remains a second-rate power. But what's striking is Athens is allowed to survive. Its democracy is allowed to remain intact, and the male citizens are not killed. A lot of these wars, what would typically happen to the defeated city is the men would be killed and the women and children would be sold into slavery. This didn't happen for Athens, not because Sparta was being generous, but because Sparta wanted to use Athens as a buffer against thieves. Keeping Athens as a city-state weak, but still around, meant thieves couldn't threaten Spartan power. So this goes back to my reference that I gave about from Xenophon, that Sparta was really using Athens as a way to ensure its own military and political power. So the democracy in theory was supposed to remain intact. But shortly after the surrender, we have a group of conspirators plot to overthrow the democracy. These men kill democratic leaders, Athenians who were supporters of the democracy. They also charge other leaders with various crimes, so they get arrested. These are all their opponents. And they plot all this in these drinking clubs, in these symposia, they're called. And these are aristocratic organizations, aristocratic affiliations of people plotting to overthrow the democracy. So once they have leaders who might prevent the oligarchs, the conspirators from seizing power, they then, at a meeting of the Athenian assembly, with Spartan troops stationed outside the meeting place, propose a motion that basically overthrows the democracy. So this is sort of the veil of constitutional legitimacy to their actions. The Athenians themselves have no choice but to accept this motion because they see the Spartan troops outside the assembly. They assume if they don't vote in favor of it, that they will be killed. And we're told later by some Athenians that the best thing you could do is either not raise your hand in favor of the motion or leave while it's being read out loud. There was no choice. So in theory, the Athenians voted the democracy out of existence and set up the 30, as they're called, to be in charge of Athens. Our later sources refer to them as the 30 Tyrants because of how brutal they behave. But tyrants is kind of a weird word to call these men because normally a tyrant ruled by himself. It was a single ruler. And so to use the word tyrant with the 30 is to emphasize their brutal form of government that they installed. So after they vote the democracy out of existence, they then proceed with a reign of terror. They allow only a small segment of the population to be franchised. About 3,000 people were allowed to enter the city, and these would be people who had property and were wealthy. Everyone else was prohibited from entering the city. They proceed to disfranchise and steal the property of the disfranchised. Many resident aliens also have their property confiscated. Many Athenians and many resident aliens are either forced into exile directly by the 30, or they flee in order to survive because they're afraid that they'll be executed. We're told that people are taken out of their houses to be killed, taken out of temples. They're not allowed sanctuary and they're killed from those areas as well. And we're told that they're prohibited burial because the 30 do not want the site of a burial to be a rallying cry against them. So our records suggest that at least 1,500 Athenians were executed by the 30. This is approximately 5% of the citizen population. And this happened in less than a year. So the reign was particularly savage. So it is not surprising, given the atrocities of the 30, that there was a resistance movement. A man by the name of Thrasybulus, a famous Athenian general who was living in exile, with a band of 70, just 70 men, seized a fort on the outskirts of Attica. We're told that by chance, providence, there was a snowstorm in March. This is in Attica, which is central Greece. It's very rare to get snow in these regions to begin with, but in March is very unusual. A snowstorm took place as they were seizing the fort, and that was one of the reasons why they were able to gain control of it, because otherwise they might not have had enough manpower in order to take the fort. So the resistance movement started off very small. So that's another important observation. We don't have a lot of Athenians responding to support the exiles, the democratic resistance at the start. From the fortress on the outskirts of Attica, they then go to the port of Piraeus, and they defeat the 30 in a set battle and gain control of the Piraeus. The 30 at that point are forced into exile. They go and retreat to Eleusis, which is a city in the suburbs of Athens in Attica. So what's interesting here is that the people living in the city of Athens, they don't now seek a reconciliation with the democratic resistance. Instead, they install a new group of oligarchs, the 10. So this is the other striking thing about the Civil War is we have all these groups labeled by different mathematical numbers, the 10, the 30, the 3,000. The 10 are now ruling Athens, and they don't seek a reconciliation with the resistance. They pursue the war, and they seek Spartan support. Sparta first helps the 10 try to stop the democratic resistance. They're now called the men of Piraeus. And they're actually successful in a set battle. But Sparta then changes course. And they probably change course because Spartan allies realize what's happening. And they don't want Sparta to control Athens. And so Sparta has to give in, and at this point it begins negotiations. And this leads to the reconciliation. And the reconciliation is really what we'll be focusing on for the rest of today. So in 403, they agree to a reconciliation which the democracy is restored. They also agree to an amnesty where all crimes committed during the Civil War, there's an amnesty for all crimes except murder or attempted murder. They can't do an amnesty for murder or attempted murder because that would be, it has a religious pollution to it. If you commit murder, you have religious pollution, miasma, and that would be dangerous for the city. So those crimes have to be prosecuted. But for all other crimes, there's an amnesty. Everyone's included in the amnesty except the main leaders of the oligarchy, and that's the 30, the 10, and then the prison guards. But the 3,000 are included in the amnesty. Now the oligarchs, the 30 and the 10, they're allowed to settle in Eleusis. That's the oligarchic stronghold that I just mentioned. But in 401 BCE, the Democrats decided to take down that stronghold, reintegrate Eleusis into Athens, and everyone who survived that battle is allowed to participate in the reconciliation of 403. And that's it. That's the end of our Civil War. So from 404 to 403. And our sources tell us, for the most part, that the reconciliation was quite successful. We get lots of praise over and over in the historians, philosophers, orators, both Greek and Roman, on the success of the reconciliation. And a lot of people think it's because of those terms that I just outlined, but what I'll show you today is, well, that's really not the case. But before we go through the specific terms, or why I think that's not the case, why I think that's not the case, I want to sort of talk about what I'll call a balance sheet. We have references to either ways in which the reconciliation worked or didn't work, and it shows mixed results. So one of the things that's striking is Aristotle, in describing the terms of the reconciliation, he starts by praising this one citizen. I always found this very odd. He praises this one citizen for, let's see, this one citizen was accused of violating the amnesty, and we had this other guy arrest him, and he's executed without a trial, the citizen who violated the amnesty. And Aristotle praises this act by saying this was good because it prevented further attempts to contradict or violate the terms of the reconciliation. I find it very puzzling that the only way they think the reconciliation could work is by prosecuting, or I'm sorry, by killing a person without a trial. To me, if anything, that suggests is how thin this reconciliation was. But apparently, according to Aristotle, that caused such fear in everyone else that no one else was willing to violate the reconciliation. Okay, so that was one thing in favor of reconciliation. So to me, that's not a great signal in favor of it. Another thing we find out is that a former member of the 10 was actually allowed back into Athens, and he was allowed to hold public offices after the restoration of democracy. This is quite remarkable, right? One of the members of the 10, this was the group of people who ruled Athens after the 30, who then brought in Spartan troops to stop the democratic resistance, was reintegrated into the Athenian democracy. So that does in fact sound like we have some willingness to let bygones be bygones. And then we do have other references to people who were supporters of the 30 who were allowed to hold office. So there are a few other examples of that. I can't say how many, I just can say some people were allowed to. So there are some illustrations in our sources, or some examples from our sources where people were allowed to participate in the democracy who had supported the 30. We also have evidence of retribution. Former knights, the cavalry, they were required to return money that they received from the oligarchs. Well, that's not terrible retribution. They got payments under the 30, they had to return the payment. We do have other evidence, though, that the cavalry of the 30, I keep giving you this, this monument, and I'll explain that in a moment. We have other evidence that there was a lot of distrust for these cavalry, and that the Athenians were not really reintegrating them into the democracy. So Xenophon tells us that a cavalry contingent was Asia Minor to support a, which in itself doesn't sound so bad, but the reason was they were hoping they would die in that campaign. So this was a way to try to get rid of some of these knights who had supported the 30. Then we have this remarkable monument. This is the Dexilaus monument. So this is a monument to celebrate a cavalry officer who died during a war in the early part of the 4th century BCE. And so this was set up by his family. The iconography is striking for artistic reasons, but for our purposes, what's interesting is the monument includes the dates of his birth and death. And that's very unusual. This is like one of the only ones in classical Greece, in classical Athens, where the birth date of the individual memorial has been included. And it's very likely that that birthday was provided that year, because it makes it clear that Dexilaus could not have served under the 30. He would have only been 10 years old. And so this further shows some of the hostility towards the cavalry. They wanted to make it clear, his family wanted to make it clear that Dexilaus was too young to have been a member of the 30 or a supporter of the 30. So these signals suggest that the Athenians weren't willing to let all supporters of the 30 back into the democracy as full citizens, that there was still some recrimination and still some retribution. We also know of some Athenians who had supported the 30 that were denied the right to hold public office under the restored democracy. So some people were allowed to and some weren't. So our results are quite mixed. Finally, I want to mention the trial of Socrates, right? 399 BCE is when Socrates was tried for impiety. Now, a lot of ancient historians think he was tried for impiety because he couldn't be tried for violating the, for a crime committed during the Civil War, because that would have violated the amnesty. What I find striking is that this trial took place. Oh, I'm sorry. Hello? Okay, I think we're okay now. I think what I find striking is I think we need somebody to be on mute who's not. Okay, let's see. If you could put yourself back on mute. All right. I think
Sorry,
we're good
Andrew.
now. Is everyone on mute? Okay, I don't think that's me. All right, let me see. Oh, right, 399 BC. Why was Socrates allowed, right, to do all his philosophizing and whatever else he was doing that might have offended the Athenians until the 4th century? He'd been around for years. This could take the entire afternoon to just discuss the trial of Socrates, but I think it's hard to make an argument that his prosecution and conviction isn't somehow related to the Civil War. And in fact, a lot of the people that he had had conversations with, if you look at a lot of the Platonic dialogues, the people who are mentioned in the Platonic dialogues were affiliated with the oligarchs. And so it seems likely that his prosecution and conviction had something to do with the oligarchy. And that one of the charges was corrupting the youth. And in fact, he had affiliations with supporters of the 30 and some of the leaders of the 30. So the charge of corrupting the youth fits in directly with those members of the 30. So I think it's very unlikely that this conviction doesn't have something to do with the Civil War, because it didn't take place before, it took place after. So I think that's one of our strongest illustrations of retribution. The Athenians were willing to put up with Socrates up until the Athenian Civil War. And after that, that's when they started to take seriously, started to be concerned about what he was teaching young aristocratic Athenians. So when we look at what happened after the Civil War, we see that in some instances, they did let bygones be bygones. In other instances, we see that they actually meted out revenge against people that they thought were responsible for some of the atrocities. The historical narratives of the Civil War also give us a very interesting perspective. And now I'm sort of shifting gears into talking about how they remembered what happened. And I think when we look at their memory, we also see this division. That's really what I'm starting to try to show you today, is that the Civil War was remembered in conflicted ways, in ways in which emphasizes how the Athenians are being torn apart. So we have two different representations of the Civil War, one by Aristotle, or one of his students, I should say, and one by Xenophon. And what's striking is they sequence what happened in completely opposite order. So in Xenophon's sequence, after the 30 seize power, the first thing they do is ask for a Spartan garrison to come to Athens. And Xenophon tells us they asked for this garrison so they could do whatever they wanted. So the first thing they do after they get the garrison is to proceed to terrorize the community, disarm the disfranchised. They execute Theramenes, who is a moderate oligarch, so that they could do more. And it's only then that the Democrats seize the fortress in Attica. So Xenophon's narrative sort of depicts the violence as causing the resistance, and that the 30 seek weapons in order to carry out their reign of terror. In Aristotle's account, it's reversed. Resistance starts first. First, the Democrats seize the fortress in Attica. Then we got a moderate oligarch speaking out against them. Then we get the violence escalating. Then we get the garrison to respond to that violence. So we've got it reversed. So this is sort of, I guess, where we are in our conversation about January 6th, right? In today, where we have two different narratives. But I do want to make something very clear about these narratives that's different. Now, when you go to Xenophon and Aristotle, they don't disagree about the nature of the violence. both Xenophon and Aristotle make it very clear that the 30 are despicable. Everything that the 30 did is bad. So it's not like in Xenophon's account, let me go back. He's saying, hey, it wasn't the 30's fault. It was the Democrats. Both blame the 30. So it's not like Xenophon is doing this to justify, I'm sorry, Aristotle is doing this to justify the 30. Both depict them negatively, which is where I think we're seeing something very different today. What's interesting is I think both Xenophon and Aristotle are trying to grapple with how do you explain the violence, right? And this is, I think, in some ways what the limit of the chronological narrative. Did the violence cause resistance, or did resistance cause the violence? And what we see is that they're sort of two are related. And I think it's inevitable that the 30 was going to cause resistance, but because of the nature of the regime. But it's also inevitable because of the nature of the regime that it was going to be violent. So you can't ever remove violence or resistance from the 30 because of the nature of that type of political system. And so the two historical narratives, Xenophon and Aristotle, are really just describing to us one type of, one component of the 30. But we do see Democrats and then later and supporters of the 30 use those narratives to justify their own beliefs. So now if we turn to what I'll call Athenian memory of the Civil War, right? Not these expert accounts. We often see the Civil War mentioned in lawsuits. And the way in which the Civil War is depicted also shows this kind of division. The first thing I want to point out, though, is that in the past, a lot of scholars would talk about the amnesty agreement as allowing for a successful reintegration of the two factions. But the problem is the amnesty agreement couldn't stop complaints. We see in the lawsuits, people are constantly bringing up the Civil War. So if there was supposed to be an amnesty, why are they bringing up the Civil War? In fact, what we see is that the law courts become a way in which to seek revenge, regardless of the amnesty. They'll bring up the Civil War in cases that have nothing to do with it. So even though you can say you can't prosecute a person for what he did during the Civil War, you can still bring it up for another prosecution. That's what happened with Socrates. So I think that illustrates the limits of the amnesty agreement. Okay, so then when we look at how the Civil War is depicted, we see ways, though, in which and sometimes it's actually conciliatory. So one thing we see is what I describe as a telescoping of time. The Battle of Aegospotami was the last battle of the Peloponnesian War. This is what caused the Athenian defeat. It was a terrible miscalculation that the generals made. The generals made this miscalculation in part because they were inexperienced. And they were inexperienced because the previous round of generals had been removed from office, some of them executed for misconduct. And so in many ways, this disaster at Aegospotami happened because the generals were just not qualified. But in the speeches after the Civil War, they say it was oligarchs that were conspiring during that battle. And so they conflate the overthrow of the democracy to the defeat. And they act as though the oligarchs were conspiring all the way back into the Battle of Aegospotami. And so the defeat, the surrender, the rule of 30, they're all become one event. The oligarchs conspired against the democracy during the last battle. They conspired for the surrender, and they caused the overthrow. So what happens is the rule of 30 becomes responsible for everything that happened before. And so then the democracy is not held liable for the failures of the Peloponnesian War. And so we have these oligarchs are all responsible for all the bad things that had happened. And so in some ways, that's a conciliatory image, right? The Athenians don't have to blame themselves now. The other thing we see happening is the demos is depicted as united during the Civil War. The jury is constantly referred to as though they were the men of Piraeus, they were the democratic resistance, even though some of the jurors on the courts after the Civil War must have remained in the city. Yet the jury is always depicted as though it was the democratic resistance, as though it had fought against the 30. So the Athenian people are not ever seen as though they were somehow involved in the actions of the 30. So we have this sort of fanciful image as though Athens remained united in spite of the Civil War, which is very odd. The last thing we see happening is we also see those kinds of images can work two ways, right? They can work one way to make everyone say, okay, we're all united, so let's all live peacefully together. But this is a good way to encourage the jurors to go against the opposing litigant. And I apologize, I have a lot of I'm a philologist at heart, so I have a long quote on this slide. This is a speech Lysias gave to prosecute somebody he accused of killing his brother. So in order to justify retribution, he calls upon the jurors. And he calls upon the jurors in a way that sort of uses that imagery that I just described. I think that the man would have to be very bold who comes here to defend himself before the very witnesses to his villainy, when the jurors are none other than the victims, his victims. So this idea of a united jury can then be manipulated in order to justify attacking someone else. So then he goes on to say how they should respond. Exhibit the same anger that you felt when you were in exile, and remember all the other injuries that you had suffered from them, right? So he's encouraging some members of the jury that may have remained in the city and may have been complicit to imagine themselves as though they were exiles. They see some by force from the agora, some from the temples, and they kill them. Others they drag from their children, their parents, and their wives, and they force them to kill themselves. And they did not allow them to have customary old burial, thinking that their regime was mightier than vengeance of the gods. So he's using this memory of the Civil War. These were all events that the Athenians would have known in order to encourage the jurors to seek retribution. So this idea of a united demos can either help promote reconciliation or can work just the opposite to help promote retribution. But the thing is, right, he's seeking retribution against one person, right? One person. And this one person is somebody who doesn't represent everyone else, the 30, the 10, all these other people who are excluded from the reconciliation agreement. So in some ways, that's how that worked, is that the retribution is by this group that's very restricted. So why was the reconciliation successful? So whether we consider the laws that were passed, the verdicts that were delivered, or the accounts of the Civil War that Athenians told each other as they convened in public, the evidence, I think, shows mixed results. Sometimes they worked through the troubling memories of the past in ways that helped heal the wounds. At other times, they acted out in ways that could be divisive and even threaten peace. Still, I think it's important to recognize that Athens did not revert to a state of civil unrest, right? We see these emotions that are very powerful, but we don't see the type of bloodshed that was happening before. And we don't see the kind of cycle of unrest that we saw at Corcyra. And it's important to recognize that there are many contributing factors that led to the success of the reconciliation, right? We can look at traditional historical arguments in favor of cause and event. We can't underestimate the importance of the demographic shifts. So some have argued that because there were fewer people of the lower classes, they couldn't seek retribution. Others have argued that Athens at this point was weak. It was still vulnerable to invasion because a section of the long walls were still exposed. As much as the Athenians may have distrusted each other, as much as they may have doubted that their neighbors would be willing to work with them in ways that would be supportive of their own political agendas, they had enemies outside of Athens. There were real foreign threats, and they had to work together to protect the city from those foreign threats. And so that may have helped encourage, or I should say, limit calls for revenge. At the same time, I would like to suggest that we should not disregard the significance of the divisions that I have outlined today, and we should consider the possibility that these divisions actually help prevent Athens from returning to civil war. As the extant speeches show, practically everyone who came to court claimed to have remained loyal to the demos during the Civil War. But the reality was in fact quite different. Some gladly helped the oligarchs overthrow the democracy, while others supported the 30 with great reluctance and only under compulsion. Some assisted the Democrats as soon as they began their campaign. Others delayed, waiting until the war was beginning to wind down. What they shared in common was the same sorrow for having lived through the Civil War, but it would have affected them quite differently because their experience varied so much. It was therefore difficult for Athenians to form a group to pursue in concert a common program of revenge and retribution against one another, because their recent experiences kept them quite divided, despite what they kept saying each time when they convened in public. Perhaps then Athens remained united, not despite its divisions, but because of them. Thank you. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Do we have any questions or comments for
Yes, I
Andrew?
have one here in the Oak Room, if you give me just a moment to walk over.
Okay.
What year did Thucydides die? Also, what was the purpose of his writing his history?
I'm sorry?
Did you get the question, Andrew?
I did, and I only heard part of it. Something, yeah. Could you repeat it?
What year did Thucydides die?
What year did Thucydides die?
Yes, and what was the purpose of his writing his?
So we don't know when we don't know when he died. We just know that it was early in the 4th century. It's his last reference to an event. So I can't remember if it was the 390s or the 380s. We know that he refers to an event in the Peloponnesian in his history that happened in the 390s or 380s. So we know that he survived the Peloponnesian War, but we don't know when he died. We also don't know whether he finished it, right? Because the work itself breaks off. Xenophon picks up right at the end of where our version of the Peloponnesian Wars stops. So what that does indicate is that, yeah, he didn't finish it. And early on in antiquity, the version that we have is the version that had survived. So it was never completed. Some historians think he gave up and he just got, either he got too depressed, I don't know if that's the right word for it, or he realized that his vision of what was happening didn't work. Others think he passed away and so he couldn't complete it. I have no idea. I don't want to speculate. It does seem he had a very specific perspective at the start, and it may have shifted because as the war kept changing, how he understood the war that didn't fit in any further or in his work. But I don't know, it's really hard to say.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else here in the opera? Andrew, thank you.
It's my pleasure.
I have a comment.
All right, go
Um,
ahead.
what, I'm sorry, did I interrupt someone?
No, go ahead.
Andrew, what similarities do you see between what was happening then and what happened on January 6th in this country?
Well, I mean, the 30 seized power, right? Our election went through, so that's a huge difference. The Athenians agreed that the 30 were bad, right? So that's another remarkable difference. We have two competing narratives, right? That's the similarity that I would say. But what's really interesting is the other difference, I think, is the people that were then identified as bad or as the opposing side were excluded from the amnesty. And so in some ways that made their situation easier because they weren't part of the political process, right? So we have two people having countering narratives. I mean, there are counter narratives now, right? Did Biden win? Did he not? Those are the two counter narratives.
Right.
There were counter narratives with the Civil War of 404 in Athens. Were the men of the city okay, or were they not that great? But the narrative about the 30, about the event, they agreed on. The 30 were bad. So I think that's the overarching message was consistent, but there are a lot of people that disagree about the outcome of the election. And that's fundamentally different. I think that's the problem, right? That's what I would say. There were different, I mean, where it was similar is you have people with two different narratives and how you deal with that. The other thing is this idea of a united demos. We don't have this idea of a united American population. That's very different. So I guess I'm saying there's probably more different than there is similar.
There's more differences than there are similarities.
Yeah.
All right, Galina, go ahead if you'd like to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can.
Yes.
Just have one question. Are there any literary texts related to the Athenian Civil War? Am I right to assume that the meaning of the Civil War was primarily formed in the courts or by later historians? Was it reflected in any significant works of literature?
So, I mean, it is mentioned in the philosophers as well, and there are comedies that, I don't know if I'd say that's mentioned, but yeah, it's mentioned in the comedies as well. There's artwork that suggests that some of the allusions to, I don't know, Harmodius and Aristogeiton start cropping up again in this period of time. Harmodius and Aristogeiton were tyrannicides. They killed tyrants in the 514 BC, 6th century, and that's cropping up now as well. So we do see allusions to it in the literature and in drama as well. Drama tends to be mythological. Comedy, Athenian comedy is shifting from old comedy, which was very political, to middle, to then new comedy, which So that those allusions are going to start to differ from what we saw in Aristophanes in the 5th century. So there are, and we certainly see it in later times, allusions to the Civil War in Roman literature as well. So they definitely are becoming an important part of the literary tradition. They sort of fit into the model of the tyrant.
All right, any final comments? Thank you, Andrew. Well, we'll look forward to our session next week. Thank you everyone for being with us, and stay well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.